I'm really pleased to get us going with our next panel session with Manolis Pagkalos, who is Associate Professor in the Humanities at the School of Humanities in Marxism, Zhejiang College of the Zhejiang ANF University. He has previously held positions at the Research Center for the Humanities in Greece, the University of Groningen, and the University of Leicester, where he obtained his PhD degree. Since 2021, he has been editor-in-chief of the nonprofit publisher Isegoria Publishing, CIC, and a visiting professor at various universities worldwide, supporting classical studies and ancient history worldwide. His research focuses on the socio-political use of the past, exploring collective memories in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Other research interests include ancient numismatics, epigraphy, modern reception, and digital humanities. He is currently working on introducing classical studies on a new curriculum for humanities students in China, as well as setting up a new research project on, and the title is The Language of Change, Examining the Negotiation of Memory in the Hellenistic World. His recent publications include a recent paper on civic religion in Hellenistic Athens, and that was out in 2026, or is coming out, in 2026, an Intellectual History Review, and an edited volume on new perspectives on the Hellenistic Peloponnese, co-edited with Andrea Scarpato for Bloomsbury in 2025. So please join me in welcoming Manolis, whose paper today is entitled Across the Vast Land and Over the Sea, the Experiences of a Member of the Academici Vagantes. And just a reminder that we'll take the Q&A for this panel at around 2:30 Pacific time. You can post questions as always using the Q&A webinar function. Welcome, Manolis.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Elke. Thank you, Hannah, for the invitation to this event. Thank you to the speakers for all their great papers till now. I'm sorry if I look a bit tired. It is 4:30 in the morning here in China, so I had to stay a bit overnight. Let's start. Let me begin by a simple image. Okay. Maybe, yeah. When many people think about classicists, I don't know, ancient historians, they imagine someone in a quiet, maybe wood-paneled library, surrounded by books, manuscripts, coins, spending a lifetime in a single institution. We all know that this is not the truth, really. My own path has been very, very different. Um, I am what I termed, when I was doing this paper, an academicus vagans, like many other people in our field, but also increasingly in other fields of the humanities. Um, we are wandering scholars. So I moved from Greece to the United Kingdom, to the Netherlands, passed from Czechia, Brazil, Mexico, and I'm currently in China, trying to build and sustain an academic career in classics and ancient history. And during this path, this journey, I understood some fundamental, for my formation at least, aspects. So today, I want to share what this means in some practical terms, how work and travel become conditions of survival rather than a luxury, how this mobility has created both opportunities and serious challenges, and how these experiences have shaped my idea of what global classics should be. So maybe my presentation at aspects today may sound like this kind of projection, shameless advertising, but it's actually the opposite, really. I mean, my CV is visible, anyone can read it, people may understand some of it. Um, so I speak about myself today as a personal experience that may provide some aspects of self-reflection without generalizing uh, in the support of anonymous masses or people that no one has a face for. So I will move through four main themes. First, the gap between this kind of romantic image of a scholar and the reality of contemporary academia, at least for our fields. Then I will move to discuss what it means to build a career by constantly crossing borders. Uh, then I will touch upon the costs of that mobility, financial, personal, okay, mental. And finally, maybe some strategies for adaptation and resistance, and some thoughts for the future. So let's start by the myths, as we normally teach. Let's look at the beginning. Uh, this kind of image of a scholar, maybe this one is um, Renaissance times, a classicist uh, in a prestigious university, spending decades reading Greek and Latin texts, and then, of course, perhaps traveling occasionally for conferences, but fundamentally, in any way, stable and secure. So, for many of us in this field, and increasingly in other fields of the humanities, that is not a reality at all. The reality, especially in the last 2 decades, is that of short-term contracts, and they become sometimes even shorter, repeated relocations, and a job market that demands constant flexibility for those that can afford it, both financially and mentally. So mobility is not simply an opportunity, it is also often an unwritten requirement of this professional path that we walk. So this kind of realization, at least for me, came quite early. I first encountered this gap between myth and reality when I was an undergraduate student in Athens, studying history and archaeology. And I quickly realized that if I wanted to pursue an academic career in my field, in ancient history, in classical studies, I would almost certainly have to leave Greece. The jobs in Greece were few and often situated in obscure networks. The competition was intense, and the expectation was also clear. If you really want to continue, you need to move forward. So I moved, but I didn't move exactly forward. I also moved away. So I went to Leicester in the UK. I finished my master. I did my PhD there. And of course, I started teaching, focusing on my field, on Hellenistic world and the use of the past of Hellenistic societies to navigate periods of change. What is, in essence, a reception of antiquity in antiquity. At the same time, I was learning that my own present would likely be defined by continuous change, one position after the other, and back then, of course, I didn't know, one country after the other. This is where the story of the academicus vagans really begins. Okay, the scholar who does not simply study movement in history, but lives in it in their personal, professional life. This is what a wise friend recently told to me, for me, right? It is both interesting aspect to think about one's life, but also I think it's a bit of an irony for one's choices. So let me sketch the route, not just as a list of places on a CV, but as a sequence of transitions. Okay, the map on your screen is just a possible path of another colleague and fellow journeyman, the anonymous academicus vagans. So from Greece, I moved to the UK in Leicester. I learned to teach as well as to research. I led seminars, I led groups, I teach Greek and Roman history, ancient Greek and Latin, supported students learning with inscriptions, coins, and texts. It is the moment formative for our academic career, this moment of PhD, where teaching stops to be a side activity and maybe becomes the main activity. Okay. Um, and as teaching was increasingly becoming that, it also really made me think about the connection to one's choices in academia, but also the connections to one's choices while teaching the ancient world. So when my time in Leicester was coming to an end, I moved again in order to persevere in teaching not being a side activity, and I moved to the Netherlands. And then I joined a research program anchoring innovation, research agenda, looking at how societies use familiar traditions to introduce new ideas. Then more teaching happened, different courses, Athenian democracy, the world of Alexander the Great, ancient economy. So moving to another country provided an excellent, different intellectual environment, but once again, this was also temporary. The contract had an end date. Then, of course, there were shorter but significant moves. Went to Czechia to teach a course on memory and the past in the ancient Greek world, to Brazil and Mexico, where I helped design and deliver some of the first dedicated courses in Greek epigraphy in those countries. And at the time, I was also cementing a greater personal perspective on academia and research. And for this aspect, I will speak to you a bit later while we are closing this paper. So, delivering courses in Brazil or standing in classrooms in Mexico City, teaching Greek inscriptions, it really hits you. It's like the realization how unevenly our discipline is distributed. Okay, Greek epigraphy has been taken for granted in many of the European universities, but there in Mexico, in Brazil, it was something almost entirely new. Naturally, this should not be a surprise, and in this way it was not, but it was this kind of another bell ringing about classical studies, about politics, about narrative, the use of our studies in contemporary politics, and all the in between around the world. In this sense, travel, of course, is not tourism. It is a way of seeing where classics are present and where it's absent, and what does that mean? So finally, I moved to China, where I now work as an associate professor. And this is the keyword now, not of classics or ancient history. I'm an associate professor in the humanities, developing a pathway in world history with a focus on Western ancient history. So I teach Greek mythology, I teach Western literature, I teach the art of public speaking to undergraduate students whose first encounters with the ancient Mediterranean often comes from some type of English or Chinese translation, but most of the time it doesn't come at all. They only have some type of knowledge about Western classics from the national curriculum and the final years of their high school. So each of these moves, each and every of these moves opened new perspectives. They gave me the chance to teach different kinds of students, collaborate with colleagues on several continents, and see how the ancient world looks from very different vantage points. And at the same time, all of this comes with a cost. Sometimes it is a visible cost, sometimes a hidden cost. And this is what I want to turn our case at now. So, when we talk about mobility or international mobility in academia, we often emphasize the benefits: new networks, new experiences, a global profile. It is also important to speak clearly about the price. So, there are, to my mind, three main dimensions. First is the financial precarity. Every move costs money. I mean, paperwork, flights, visas, deposits for a new house, moving furniture or buying furniture, sometimes language courses. The gaps between the contracts can mean months without an income, precisely when expenses are the highest. The expectation that early career scholars will absorb all these costs, often with modest salaries and limited institutional support, turns mobility into a financial risk. It's like an investment, but the return is not even visible sometimes. And then, of course, we have bureaucracy. Every country has its own administrative landscape, work permits, resident permits, tax numbers, bank accounts, recognition of qualifications, health insurance, you name it. For someone moving every few years, these are not occasional inconveniences. They become a permanent part of life. Just as you begin to understand one system, maybe you need to move to another and start again from zero. That is, if you really want maybe to remain in the field. The energy required to repeatedly learn new bureaucratic structures is rarely acknowledged, but it is directly affecting how much time and focus remains for research and teaching once again. And then, of course, there is the third aspect, which I think it's much more important and much more real, much deeper. It is harder to quantify, and this is the psychological labor. And it comes in tandem with the previous aspects. So its move means leaving behind friends, colleagues, familiar places, and routines, and arriving in a place where you may not know anyone. By definition, mobility also tests the limits and strains personal relationships, even with your partner, spouse, your family members, your close friends, and so on. And every time you must build new networks, you need to adapt to new classroom cultures. You sometimes need to learn, as I said earlier, new languages, eh, or at least understand the new conventions. Um, One can still be teaching similar material. Is it Greek history, Roman politics, Hellenistic culture? It doesn't matter. But the ways in which students respond and the expectations they bring into the classroom or their intellectual way of thinking can really differ greatly between, say, the UK or Mexico, between the Netherlands and China. Adapting one's teaching style is intellectually enriching, but constantly doing so while also applying, I don't know, for the next job is really, really exhausting. Of all of this takes place under the long shadow of an uncertain job market. While you are fully engaged in your current role, you are also writing applications, you're assembling dossiers, you're tailoring cover letters, and of course, occasionally you fly for interviews. Behind every position you do obtain lies a long list of positions that you did not obtain. Okay. So the language of success in academia very much hides this reality. So it was this combination of financial, bureaucratic, and psychological pressures that led me to write about the figure of the academicus vagans. It is the contemporary wandering academic. I treat this not only as a personal story, but as a structural condition that shapes the lives of many scholars today, particularly in the fields like classics and ancient history, and in terms shapes the way that we are thinking and what we are seeing, if we wish to look at. So, faced with these pressures, one can simply endure or try to change course entirely. I chose the third path to adapt when necessary, but also to resist in some concrete ways. One form of adaptation has been pedagogical, okay, teaching in different contexts, different locations, in different countries, pushed me to refine my student-centered inclusive approach. Okay. I am not a lecturer, I am not the wise person in the room, I am not the sole source of knowledge. Instead, I try to create spaces where students can bring their own perspectives and questions. Whether I'm working with first year students in Leicester, or graduate students in Brazil, or undergraduates with no knowledge of the ancient world in China, I try to ask, what does the ancient world look like from where you stand, from here? What connections make sense in this context? And then, of course, one becomes more aware of the uses of the past and the divides. So this approach has not been purely idealistic, if I can say. It has also been very, very practical. It's tangible. When you constantly enter new classrooms, it becomes essential to listen carefully, to read the room, to allow the students to co-shape the discussion. It is one way of turning the instability uh, of the wandering academic into a type of a strength. On the side of resistance, I turn to in a way, institution building, okay, in a small but very deliberate scale. Together with colleagues, I founded a digital open access publishing house and an associated journal dedicated to classical studies. The aim for this is straightforward: to support the unrestricted dissemination of research and to create a platform where scholars from the global south and the global north, from east and west, can publish on equal terms. Now, having taught in places with very different levels of library access and institutional resources, uh, knowing different systems from different countries, seeing the paywalls and the traditional prestige hierarchies that limit who can participate in academic conversation led to this kind of open access. Open access is not a cure-all, but is one concrete step towards a more inclusive model. A model from scholars, for scholars, and to scholars. For me, this was a way of using the experience of mobility, the networks, the contracts, the awareness of inequalities to build something more stable and more widely accessible than any one job. So at the same time, my research on the political use of the past, on how ancient communities used memory and tradition to negotiate power, began to resonate with my own situation. I could see more clearly how our discipline constructs its own stories about legitimacy, about authority, about negotiating power. Okay, which institutions count as central, which lands and journals are considered prestigious, whose labor is visible and whose labor is not. In that sense, my own wandering has not only been geographical, it has also been a movement across different levels of the academic system, from the periphery to the center and back again, from Athens to, to Central Europe and then back on the periphery in China now. So, one moment. Let me end by turning to the phrase global classics. Global classics sounds very attractive, and in many ways it reflects some real changes. Today, classics and ancient history are taught and researched in many places across the world. My own path from Greece to the UK to the Netherlands to Czechia to Brazil, Mexico, and China is just one small illustration of this. But if global classics is to be more than a slogan, we need to consider the conditions under which this globalization is happening. Okay, how narratives are constructed, how divides are built again. If international experience is built on precarious contracts, financial risk, and a constant psychological strain, then we should be honest about that. We cannot celebrate mobility without addressing the costs, all of it, from intellectual to practical. So, of course, as you can see on the screen, there are elements for a sustainable model, at least in terms of the practicalities. So we can think about better ways of hiring and promoting people, institutional support for relocation and visas, rather than assuming that this is just something that people can manage. We can think about really the recognition of this kind of international cross-cultural teaching and collaboration, which is not an optional extra anymore, but it is now a core contribution. But these are practical things that we should change in our institutions, in our way of thinking. But there are some other things that are much deeper. From my position now, I still live as an academicus vagans to some extent. I work in China, where I collaborate with colleagues in Europe and the Americas. I continue to travel for research and teaching. I also try to use position to speak about the human dimension of academic mobility. But I want to speak even more so about intellectual stability. Okay, what is the narrative about classics? Who is using it and for what? What we were saying, listening earlier from Samuel, for example. how it is used to raise walls or to create even more divides. And in the way of that mobility, how can we create this kind of stability for others? How instead of dividing, can we build bridges? How we can give battles together? If there is one idea that I would like to leave you with is this. Mobility in academia should be a genuine choice, not a compulsory test of endurance that it is now. Crossing borders can enrich our research and our teaching, and definitely shape a more holistic view of our discipline and the world we live in. But as scholars of the ancient world, we know how much societies depend on those who preserve, interpret, and transmit knowledge. It is worth asking that what kind of conditions we create for those people today, and how can we do that better. Thank you very much for your time and attention.